The silence isn't an absence of sound. That's the first thing you have to understand. It's not empty, it's a presence. It's a heavy, weighted blanket that smothers the world. It arrives at my house every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. and it takes everything. It takes the hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the old house settling, the distant rumble of the late-night freight train. It even takes the sound of my own breathing. And in the stillness it leaves behind, something else waits. It started about 3 months after I moved into my grandparents' house. They'd both passed within a year of each other, leaving the old craftsman to me, their only grandchild. It was a generous inheritance, but a lonely one. The house sits on 2 acres of land just outside of Scappoose, Oregon, flanked on 3 sides by a dense, uninviting wall of Douglas firs that drink the light, even on the brightest days. It was the house I'd spent summers in as a kid, a place of warm memories, the smell of cedar shingles baking in the sun, the taste of my grandmother's blackberry pie. But living there alone was different. The familiar creaks and groans of the old structure, once comforting, now sounded like unfamiliar footsteps in the night. My life was, by design, a quiet one. I'm a technical writer for a software firm based in Portland, but I'd arranged to work fully remote. My days were structured, methodical. I'd wake at 7, brew a pot of dark roast coffee in the old drip machine that gurgled and hissed like a dying animal, and sit at the large oak desk my grandfather had built. I'd work until noon, listening to the soft tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that had been the steady heartbeat of this house for 60 years. I'd break for lunch, usually a sandwich eaten on the back porch, watching the mist curl through the trees. The afternoons were for more work, and the evenings were for reading, for quiet contemplation, for the low murmur of a documentary on the television. The soundscape of my life was a subtle symphony of mundane noises, the gentle whir of my computer's cooling fan, the low, electric hum of the ancient refrigerator in the kitchen, the sigh of the forced-air furnace kicking on in the basement, the whisper of wind through the high branches of the firs, the distant, lonely horn of the freight train as it crossed the highway 5 miles away. These were the sounds of my solitude, the threads that wove the fabric of my normal, peaceful existence. I had built a life of predictable, comfortable silence. The irony is not lost on me now. The first time it happened, I was up late, pushing to meet a deadline. A dense, cold fog had rolled in from the coast, pressing against the windows like a physical entity. The house felt particularly isolated that night. My desk lamp cast a small, warm circle of light in the otherwise dark study, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air. I was deep in concentration, mapping out a complex user interface guide, when a sudden change in the atmosphere made me lift my head. It wasn't a sound that alerted me. It was the opposite. The hum of my computer was gone. The tick-tock from the hallway had stopped. I strained my ears. The refrigerator silent. The furnace silent. The wind, which had been rattling a loose pane in the window frame, was also gone. It was a complete and total cessation of all noise. My first thought was a power outage, but the desk lamp was still on. The monitor glowed with my half-finished document. I stood up, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. The silence was unnerving. It was absolute. I couldn't even hear the faint, residual ringing in my ears that you notice in a soundproof room. This was a dead, flat, pressure-filled void. I walked out of the study and into the hallway. The face of the grandfather clock was frozen, the long, elegant pendulum hanging perfectly still. I pulled out my phone, 2:17 a.m. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but my phone's clock told me it was only about 90 seconds. I held my breath, listening for something, anything. I felt a strange pressure in my sinuses, as if the air itself had become thick and heavy. And then, as suddenly as it had stopped, everything returned. There was a soft click from the grandfather clock as the pendulum swung back to life, a tick-tock that sounded jarringly loud in the restored ambience. The refrigerator in the kitchen shuddered and began to hum again. Outside, a gust of wind threw a handful of wet leaves against the window pane. I could hear my own ragged breath, the frantic thumping of my heart in my chest. I dismissed it. A bizarre electrical flicker, a freak power surge that affected only things with motors and moving parts. A weird, unexplainable fluke. I went back to my desk, my concentration shattered, and tried to forget the profound wrongness of that perfect, empty quiet. The next night I went to bed at my usual time, around 11, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the silence. I found myself listening to the normal night sounds of the house with an almost painful intensity, cataloging them, clinging to them. The creak of a floorboard upstairs, the drip of water in the kitchen sink I kept meaning to fix, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. At 2:10 a.m. I was wide awake, my heart thudding with a strange sense of dread and anticipation. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I watched the glowing red numerals of my alarm clock. 2:15, 2:16, and then at 2:17 it happened again. The world went dead. The faint electrical whine of the alarm clock vanished. The furnace, which had been blowing warm air through the vents, cut out. The house was plunged into that same profound, suffocating stillness. This time I was ready for it. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide in the darkness, and listened. I heard nothing, not my own breathing, not the rustle of the sheets as I moved. It felt as if I had been submerged in deep water. The pressure was there again, a physical weight on my eardrums. I was terrified, but a part of me, the rational, technical writer part, was also morbidly curious. It lasted for 2 minutes this time. At 2:19 a.m. the furnace sighed back to life, the clock began to hum, and the world was normal again. But I knew then that it wasn't a fluke. Over the next week it became a ritual. Every night at 2:17 a.m. the house would go silent for a period ranging from 90 seconds to 3 minutes. I started to document it in a small notebook. Time of onset, 2:17:00 a.m. Time of conclusion, varied. Phenomena, total cessation of ambient and mechanical sound. Physical sensations, oral pressure, feeling of being watched. The feeling of being watched was new. It began around the fourth or fifth night. In the crushing silence, my other senses seemed to heighten. My eyes would play tricks on me. I'd see a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow in the corner of the bedroom that seemed to deepen and coalesce for a moment before I turned to look at it, only to find nothing. I started leaving a nightlight on in the hallway, but its soft glow only served to create longer, more menacing shadows. I decided I needed proof. I couldn't tell anyone about this. They'd think I was losing my mind. My friend Mark, who I'd known since college, called one afternoon to check in. I tried to sound normal, but my voice was strained, my answers clipped. "You sound tired, man," he'd said, concern in his voice. "Everything okay out there in the woods?" "Yeah, fine," I'd lied, my eyes darting around the room, already anticipating the coming night. "Just been working late. You should come into the city for the weekend. We'll grab a beer, see a band. Get you out of that spooky old house." I made a non-committal excuse. The thought of leaving the house, of not being there to observe the 2:17 event, filled me with a strange mix of relief and anxiety. I was becoming obsessed. That night I set up my phone on my bedside table to record the audio. I started the recording at 2:15 a.m. I lay perfectly still in bed, listening. The silence fell right on schedule. I endured the 2 minutes of unnerving quiet, my eyes scanning the dark corners of my room. When the sound returned, I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, and stopped the recording. I played it back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I heard the sound of my own breathing from 2:15 to 2:17. Then, exactly at the moment the silence had begun, the recording turned to a harsh, grating static, like a radio tuned between stations. The static continued for 2 minutes, and then, just as abruptly, my breathing was audible again. It hadn't recorded silence. It had recorded a total failure of the recording device, a blast of white noise, as if the silence was something so absolute it couldn't be processed, only broken by. This was worse. This meant it wasn't just in my head, but it was also something that defied simple explanation. It was a phenomenon that actively resisted being documented. The exhaustion started to set in, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that no amount of coffee could penetrate. I dreaded going to bed. Sleep was a precious commodity, but the approach of 2:17 a.m. always woke me, my body's internal clock now calibrated to the nightly event. I became gaunt, with dark, bruised-looking circles under my eyes. My work suffered. I'd stare at the screen for hours, unable to form a coherent sentence. My world had shrunk to the four walls of that house, and the 2 or 3 minutes of oppressive stillness that governed my life. In a desperate attempt to reclaim some sense of normalcy, to introduce another living, breathing thing into the house, I adopted a dog. He was a 3-year-old golden retriever from a local shelter, a cheerful, goofy animal named Buster. For the first few days, he was a godsend. His presence was a comfort. The soft padding of his paws on the hardwood floors, the jingle of his collar, his happy sighs as he slept at the foot of my bed, they were all welcome additions to the house's soundscape. They were anchors to reality. I hoped, prayed that his presence would somehow break the spell. But on the first night he was there, I was awoken at 2:16 a.m. not by my own anxiety but by Buster. He was whining, a low, guttural sound of pure distress. He had crawled up from the foot of the bed and was pressing his body against my side, his muscles rigid, his head tucked under my arm. And then 2:17 hit. The silence fell, and Buster's whining stopped. He didn't make a sound. He just trembled, his entire body shaking violently against me in the dead, still air. His fear was a tangible thing in the room, more real and terrifying than my own. It confirmed my deepest horror. This was real. It wasn't my imagination. The dog felt it too. The next night I decided to test it. I had to know what would happen if I tried to make a sound during the silence. I sat on the edge of the bed with Buster shivering beside me and waited. The moment the silence descended, I raised my hands and clapped. The resulting sound was hideous. It was a flat, wet, percussive thump, with no echo, no resonance. It was as if the sound waves left my hands and were immediately swallowed by the thick, sound-devouring air. It was the auditory equivalent of shouting into a pillow. I tried to yell. I opened my mouth, forced air from my lungs, but the sound was trapped in my throat. I could feel the vibration in my vocal cords, but the sound was stolen before it could ever form. It was a violation of the laws of physics, a chilling negation of reality itself. Paranoia began to consume me. Was the house haunted? Was it some kind of localized temporal anomaly? Or was I the one who was broken? Was this some rare, bizarre form of auditory hallucination, a tumor pressing on a nerve in my brain? I considered seeing a doctor, a psychiatrist, but what would I say? "Doctor, my house goes quiet for 2 minutes every night." I'd be committed. The isolation was the worst part. I was trapped in this experience, a solitary prisoner in my own home. The house itself, once a place of comfort, now felt like a sentient entity, a predator that was slowly, patiently digesting me. The long hallways seemed to stretch in the dim light. The familiar portraits of my grandparents on the wall seemed to watch me with vacant, pitying eyes. The house knew. It was complicit. The grandfather clock in the hall became the focus of my dread. Its steady tick-tock was no longer a comfort. It was a countdown. Each swing of the pendulum was a step closer to the abyss. Sometimes I would just stand in the hallway and watch it, mesmerized by its methodical, relentless march towards 2:17. After a month of this torment, something inside me broke. The exhaustion, the fear, the constant, grinding uncertainty. I couldn't live like that anymore. I couldn't just lie in bed and wait for it to happen. I had to confront it. I had to see it. I had to know what was at the heart of the silence. That night I didn't go to bed. I brewed a pot of coffee as strong as tar and sat in the living room in my grandfather's old leather armchair. I positioned the chair so it faced the long, central hallway. At the far end of the hall was the front door. To the left was the study. To the right, the dining room and the kitchen. And right in the middle of the hallway, against the wall, stood the grandfather clock. I turned on every light downstairs. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen, the porch light. I wanted no shadows, no corners for my terrified mind to populate with phantoms. Buster, sensing my agitation, refused to settle. He paced nervously around the room, whining softly, his claws clicking on the floorboards. Finally, he lay down by my feet, his head on my boots, his body tense. I sat there for hours, sipping my coffee, the mug warm in my trembling hands. The house groaned and creaked around me. The furnace kicked on and off. The refrigerator hummed. Each normal sound was a small blessing, a temporary reprieve. And through it all, the steady, metronomic tick-tock from the hall. At 2:00 a.m., the house seemed to grow colder. A draft snaked its way across the floor, chilling my ankles. Buster lifted his head and let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the dark maw of the hallway. Tick-tock, tick-tock. My heart beat in time with the clock. My senses were on fire. Every nerve ending felt raw, exposed. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. It felt like the moments before a thunderstorm, the world holding its breath. 2:15. Buster's growl turned into a sustained, terrified whine. He pressed himself against my leg, refusing to look down the hall any longer. 2:16. I could feel the pressure building in my ears. The light from the hallway lamp seemed to dim, to turn a sickly yellow. The tick-tock of the clock sounded impossibly loud, each beat a hammer blow against my skull. I held my breath. Tick-tock, tick, and then silence. It crashed down on the house like a wave. It was instantaneous. One moment the world was filled with sound, the next it was gone. The silence was deeper, heavier than it had ever been before. The pressure in my head was immense, a crushing weight. The lights flickered violently for a second, then stabilized, but their glow seemed weak, pathetic against the oppressive stillness. I sat frozen in the chair, my knuckles white on the armrests. My eyes were locked on the hallway. The grandfather clock was motionless, its pendulum a dead weight. Buster was utterly still and silent at my feet, a statue of fur and fear. And then I saw it. It wasn't a figure. It wasn't a ghost. It was a distortion. At the far end of the hall, near the front door, the air itself seemed to ripple, like heat haze off summer asphalt. A patch of darkness in the well-lit hallway began to congeal. It wasn't a shadow cast by anything. It was a spot of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was a hole in the world. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, to leave this place and never come back. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like a physical restraint. But underneath the terror was the gnawing, desperate need to know. I had to. Slowly, shakily, I pushed myself out of the chair. The movement was soundless. My feet on the old Persian rug made no noise. Buster didn't move, didn't even seem to be breathing. I took one step, then another, into the hallway. My body felt sluggish, like I was moving through molasses. The air was frigid near the distortion, a pocket of deep, unnatural cold. The walk down that 30-foot hallway was the longest journey of my life. My own heartbeat was a dull, silent thud I could feel in my teeth. My lungs burned for air, but the act of breathing seemed to have been erased. Each step was a monumental effort of will. The patch of impossible darkness grew larger as I approached, and the cold intensified. It felt like freezer burn on my skin. I stopped about 10 feet from the front door. The blackness was right in front of it, a shimmering, amorphous void hanging in the air. I could see the edges of the doorframe through it, but they were warped and bent, as if viewed through a flawed lens. And then I noticed something that made the blood freeze in my veins, the peephole on the front door. Normally, it was a dark, brass circle, but now a tiny pinprick of light was glowing from its center. It wasn't the yellow light of the porch lamp. It was a pale, cold, sterile light, and it was coming from inside the peephole. Light shouldn't come out of a peephole. The compulsion was absolute. Overriding every instinct for self-preservation was the insane, suicidal need to look. To see what was on the other side of that door, what was at the heart of the silence. My legs moved on their own. I closed the final distance to the door, my hand reaching out, trembling uncontrollably. My fingers brushed the cold wood. The cold from the void was so intense it felt like it was leaching the warmth directly from my bones. I leaned forward, my breath hitching in my silent chest, and pressed my eye to the peephole. I didn't see my front porch. I didn't see the fog-shrouded fir trees or the wet gravel of my driveway. I saw my living room. I was looking through my own front door into my own house. The perspective was distorted, fish-eyed, but it was unmistakably my living room, illuminated by the same lamps I had turned on. I could see the patterned rug. I could see the bookshelves. I could see the back of the brown leather armchair. And I could see myself. A figure was sitting in the chair. It was me. I was looking at the back of my own head, my own familiar brown hair, the shape of my shoulders in my gray sweatshirt. The figure was perfectly still, facing away from the hall, staring into the living room. A wave of vertigo and nausea washed over me. My mind buckled, unable to process the paradox. I was standing here at the door looking in at myself, sitting in the chair. It was impossible. It was a violation of everything I knew to be true. And then the figure in the chair began to move. Slowly. Horribly. Its head began to turn, swiveling on its neck with an unnatural smoothness, turning away from the living room towards the hallway, towards the front door, towards the peephole, towards me. I didn't see its face. I couldn't. I ripped myself away from the door, a scream tearing through my throat but making no sound. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor, scrambling away like a crab, my eyes still fixed on the door, on the peephole where that cold light still shone. Just as the figure in the chair would have completed its turn to face me, the silence broke. The sound that returned was a physical blow. The grandfather clock chimed once, a deafening, discordant clang that reverberated through the house. The furnace roared to life. The refrigerator kicked on with a violent shudder, and my own scream, finally freed, ripped through the air, raw and animalistic. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. It's a blur of pure, mindless panic. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed Buster, who was now barking hysterically, and fled. I didn't take my wallet, my keys, my phone. I ran out the back door, across the wet lawn, and into the cold, damp woods, not stopping until my lungs were on fire and my legs gave out. I eventually made my way to the highway and flagged down a trucker. I must have looked like a madman, covered in mud, wild-eyed, with a terrified dog in my arms. I never went back to the house. Not once. I called Mark from a payphone at a gas station, my voice a broken, trembling thing. He drove out and met me, took me in without asking too many questions, his face a mask of worry. I hired a company to clear out the house. Movers. They packed up my entire life and put it in storage. I told the realtor to sell the property as is, take whatever she could get. I couldn't bring myself to explain why. I just said I was relocating for a job. She must have thought I was insane, walking away from a house I owned outright. She was probably right. I live in a city now. A small, cramped apartment on the fourth floor of a building that never sleeps. The sounds are constant. Sirens, traffic, the bass from my neighbor's stereo, the chatter of people on the street below. I keep the television on all the time, even when I sleep. I have a fan for white noise and a sound machine that plays looped recordings of rain and thunderstorms. I surround myself with a fortress of noise because silence is the enemy. True silence. I am forever haunted by what I saw. I don't know what it was. A ghost. A time loop. A glimpse into another dimension that briefly intersected with my own. Or was the thing in the chair the true resident of that house, and I was just the ghost looking in? The questions are a poison for which there is no antidote. The not knowing is a special kind of torment. I have a new fear now, one that is more specific. I have a pathological terror of the time 2:17 a.m. I've covered the clock on my microwave with tape. I never wear a watch. But sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night with a jolt of anxiety and my stupid, traitorous hand will reach for my phone on the nightstand. My thumb will press the button illuminating the screen. And I'll see it. 2:16 a.m. My blood runs cold. My breath catches in my chest. I lie there, rigid, listening to the hum of the city, the rumble of the subway blocks away, the whir of my fan. I listen to these sounds like a drowning man listens for a rescuer's voice. I pray that they don't stop. But I know with a certainty that chills me to the core that one night they will. One night I'll wake up and the city outside my window will be quiet. The fan will be still. The television will be mute. The silence has my address. It knows where I am. And it's only a matter of time before it comes to reclaim me.